My name is Arthur Penn, and for 48 years, I was a U.S. Forest Ranger in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. I'm telling you this now because the official story of my retirement is a lie. A quiet, papered-over disgrace I accepted to protect a truth that would, I think, break the world's heart. Most of what you've heard about these creatures, these giants of the woods, is wrong. It's all about fear, about grainy photos and monstrous roars in the dark. But you've never heard the reason they hide. You've never heard about their fragility. I'm here to confess that I fed one of them for nearly half a century. I kept one of them alive, and in the end, after all that time, it showed me the terrible, humbling reason they truly need us to survive. A reason that has nothing to do with being found, and everything to do with what we're leaving behind. My credibility isn't a diploma or a title you can look up, not anymore. My credibility is etched into my bones. It's the permanent damp chill of the old-growth canopy that seeps in deeper than rain, a feeling I still have even sitting here, miles away from the trees. It's knowing every inch of the Nooksack River watershed by the sound of its flow, from the whisper in August to the roar in April. I can tell you, just by listening, the exact pitch the wind makes coming off Mount Shuksan on a clear night, a high, lonely sound, like glass shivering. I know the specific, sharp crackle of hemlock needles under a boot versus the soft, damp crush of a sword fern. My life was the forest, measured in seasons of silence and the static crackle of a radio. That's my proof. I know the baseline. I know what normal sounds like. And I know the exact moment it was shattered. For 48 years, my world was governed by the rigid spine of procedure. Patrol logs filled out in triplicate. Entries detailing trail conditions and animal signs, all written in neat, block letters. Twice daily radio check-ins, my voice echoing back at me from a dispatcher 50 miles away. A fragile connection to the human world. And then, there was the silence in between. Miles and miles of it. A quiet so profound you could hear your own blood moving in your ears. People from the city think it's peaceful. It's not. It's watchful. It's a living thing. And you learn to read its moods. You learn that a sudden, unnatural quiet is more dangerous than any roar. My entire existence was built on this foundation of rules, of observation, of predictable patterns. To survive out there, you trust the patterns, you trust the rules, until you hear something that breaks them all. This all started in the autumn of '74, but the stage was set 2 years earlier. I was still carrying the weight of a hiker I'd failed to find. A young man from Seattle, barely 20. We found his pack, his tent, but never him. The search was called off after 2 weeks of cold, driving rain. Everyone else went home, but I never really stopped looking. That failure became a ghost that walked with me. It made me push further, walk every trail twice, check every ravine, listen more intently to that silence. It was a kind of penance, I suppose. A silent promise I'd made to the forest itself, that I wouldn't fail like that again. I was alert, I was meticulous, but I was also wounded. And a wounded man, out in the wild, is liable to do things he otherwise wouldn't. He's liable to see a chance for redemption where others would only see a risk. That's when I heard it. I was on a secondary trail, one that hadn't been cleared since the last big windfall, checking for erosion near the base of a scree slope. The air was cold and sharp, with the smell of wet decay. And then, the sound. It cut right through the quiet drone of the forest. It was a low, guttural moan that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't a bear. I know their sounds of pain, the huffing growls. It wasn't a cougar. Their screams are terrifying, but thin, like a woman shrieking. This was different. This was a sound of pure, bottomless agony, so deep and resonant it made the air itself feel heavy, thick. Every bird within a half-mile radius went dead silent. The entire forest was listening. It was the sound of something immense, something powerful, brought low by absolute misery. Protocol is simple. You hear an unknown vocalization from a potentially large animal. You back away slowly. You get to a safe distance. You get on the radio, and you report it. You call for backup, maybe a biologist. You do not, under any circumstances, move toward the sound. It's the first rule of self-preservation, written in the blood of rangers and hunters who thought they knew better. Every instinct, every year of my training, screamed at me to retreat to the tree line, key the mic on my radio, and make the call. But all I could hear was that sound. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. It was the sound of a life bleeding out into the dirt, alone, and that ghost of the lost hiker whispered in my ear. I couldn't walk away. I couldn't let another one be lost in my forest, not if I could help it. So I broke the first rule. I turned off my radio. I followed the sound for a quarter of a mile, moving as quietly as I could. It led me to a steep, rocky ravine choked with alder and devil's club. The groaning was weaker now, punctuated by a ragged, wet breathing that sounded like a huge bellows with a hole in it. I crept to the edge and looked down, and that's when my world tilted on its axis. He was slumped against a recent rockfall, a creature of impossible scale, 9 feet tall if he was an inch, covered in dark, matted fur. His left leg was trapped beneath a boulder the size of my truck's engine block, twisted at an angle that made my own bones ache in sympathy. The smell hit me then, wet earth, wet fur, and the coppery tang of blood. He wasn't a monster, he was a victim, trapped, wounded, and dying. The choice, standing there on that ledge, felt both simple and impossibly heavy. I could turn my radio back on, I could report the impossible, and I knew what would happen. It wouldn't be a rescue, it would be a circus of helicopters and guns and nets. Scientists and reporters and government agents would descend on my forest, my sanctuary, and tear it apart looking for their prize. They would turn this magnificent, suffering creature into a specimen, a headline, a monster for their cage. The other choice was to walk away, to pretend I'd seen nothing, to leave him there to die slowly in the cold. A fate I wouldn't wish on a wolf, to let the forest keep its secret, but at the cost of my own soul. I would be haunted by 2 ghosts then, instead of 1. I did neither. There is a saying among the old-timers, the forest has its own rules, not our rules, not the government's, its own. And in that moment, I decided to follow them. I looked at that creature, saw the slow rise and fall of his chest, and I made a choice that would define the rest of my life. I backed away from the ravine, as silently as I had approached, and I walked the 2 miles back to my patrol cabin. My mind was a blizzard of consequences, of the lies I would have to tell, the career I was putting on the line. But my feet were steady. I wasn't running away. I was going to get supplies. For the first time in my career, I was going completely off the books. I was choosing the forest over the world outside it. I didn't take a gun. I didn't take a camera. I went back with a small hand axe, a coil of rope, and a splint I fashioned from 2 straight, strong Douglas fir saplings, and my entire personal supply of jerky and dried fruit. Everything I had. The walk back felt different. The air was still cold, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of this secret I now carried. When I got to the ravine, he was still there, his head now slumped against his chest. His breathing was shallower. He watched me as I carefully climbed down, his dark eyes following my every move. There was no aggression. There was just a deep, weary intelligence, a knowing. I didn't speak. I just laid the food down a few feet from him, and then I got to work on the rock. It took me almost an hour, using the saplings as levers, to shift the boulder just enough. He let out a low grunt as the pressure released, but he made no move toward me. When his leg was free, I laid the splint against it and bound it tight with the rope. It was a clumsy, pathetic attempt, I'm sure, but it was all I could do. He just watched. When I was done, I backed away, collected my axe, and climbed out of the ravine. I didn't look back. I had broken every rule. I had lied on my patrol log for that day, citing a washout inspection. I had made contact with something that shouldn't exist, and I had chosen to help it. I chose silence. I chose to carry that secret alone. And that act, that first offering, was the beginning of it all. If you've ever had to keep a secret that you knew could change everything, a secret you had to protect no matter the cost, then maybe you'll understand. It's a heavy weight to carry alone. If you think this story is worth telling, please show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who you think needs to hear it. You'll want to stay until the very end, because you need to understand why I had no other choice, and why their greatest secret was never that they exist, but how they're forced to survive. For a week, I heard nothing. The silence in the forest returned, but it was different now. It was a hollow, expectant quiet. The ghost of that lost hiker was replaced by the ghost of a living giant. I did my patrols, filled out my logs with lies of omission, and every crack of a twig, Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt through my system. I had to know. After 7 days of eating myself alive with the question, I broke my own rule and went back to the ravine. It was empty. The ground was disturbed, but he was gone. And so was the jerky, the fruit, the splint, the rope. Everything. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees washed over me, followed immediately by a new, sharper kind of fear. He was alive. He was out there. And he knew who I was. My act of mercy hadn't ended things. It had started something I couldn't possibly control. I couldn't just let it go. This was no longer about a single act of mercy. It was a responsibility. I had intervened. I had tangled my scent, my presence, with his survival. To just walk away now felt like a different kind of abandonment. He was wounded, and the coming winter would be harsh. For days, my mind raced, trying to build a protocol for the impossible. I needed a system, a way to continue this without leading anyone else to him, and without breaking the fragile, terrifying trust I might have earned. I couldn't go back to the ravine. It was too exposed, too close to the site of the accident. I needed a dead drop. A place that was both accessible to me and defensible for him. A place that felt like neutral ground, a silent embassy between our two worlds. My choice was a matter of instinct, of forest logic. I was choosing to make this a part of my life. I knew the place as soon as the idea formed. About a mile north of the ravine, on the edge of the timberline where the ancient firs give way to alpine meadows, stood a colossal western red cedar. It had been struck by lightning a century ago, hollowing out its base to create a small, dark cavern within the living tree. The wind always seemed to whistle through a knothole near the top, creating a low, mournful hum. It was a landmark, a place of power. It felt sacred, in a way. That's where it would be. One evening, just as the sun bled out behind the peaks, I made my first real offering. A small bundle of venison scraps from a deer that had been hit on the highway, wrapped in broad maple leaves. I placed it deep inside the hollow of the cedar, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt eyes on me from the shadows of the tree line. I didn't look. I just turned and walked away, the sound of my own breathing unnaturally loud in the twilight. For 2 days, nothing happened. I did my patrols. I answered my radio, and I felt like a fraud. Every moment was layered with this secret. On the 3rd night, I couldn't wait any longer. I went back. The air was cold, the moon a silver sliver behind the clouds. I approached the cedar with a feeling of dread and foolishness. I reached into the hollow, my hand shaking slightly. It was empty. The leaf-wrapped bundle was gone. There was nothing else. No sign, no sound, just an absence. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Success, because he had taken it. He was accepting the help, but also a flicker of disappointment. Was that all this was going to be? A one-way charity? Me, leaving food in a tree for a ghost. It felt incomplete. A conversation with no reply. I stood there for a long time, just listening to the wind in the branches, feeling smaller and more alone than ever. The reply came a week later. It wasn't at the cedar. It was miles away, on a part of my patrol route I hadn't checked since the last heavy rain. I was heading toward a steep switchback trail notorious for rock slides. As I rounded a bend, I saw it. Placed dead in the center of the path were 3 flat stones, stacked neatly on top of each other. It was so deliberate, so out of place, that I stopped dead. It wasn't a natural formation. It hadn't been there on my last pass. I stood there, staring at it, a cold prickle running up my spine. My first thought was another hiker. But the ground was soft, and there were no other boot prints. As I hesitated, a low, distant rumble vibrated through the soles of my boots. Up ahead, around the next bend, a shower of rock and dirt cascaded down, completely obliterating the trail I was about to walk on. The stones weren't a curiosity. They were a stop sign. It hit me then, with the force of a physical blow. This was not charity. This was a trade. It was communication. He wasn't just a scavenger taking what was left for him. He was an active participant. He was watching my routes, anticipating my movements, and warning me. He was paying me back, in the only language he had, the language of the forest. The silent, unspoken contract was now clear. My offerings of food for his knowledge of the terrain, his survival for mine. My secret now had a purpose, a shape. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was a pact. A phrase I'd heard from an old-timer came back to me, clear as a bell. The forest has its own rules. I was finally learning them. This realization filled me with a terrifying kind of elation. I was no longer just a ranger observing the wilderness. I was in a dialogue with it. That first warning cemented the ritual. It was no longer a question of if I would continue, but how. I settled into a routine that became the hidden rhythm of my life. Every third night, just as the light began to fail, I would make the journey. I prepared the offerings with care. Scraps of venison, foraged camas roots I'd boil first, and sometimes, when I had a resupply, a small selfish luxury I decided to share. A bar of dark chocolate, broken into squares. I'd wrap it all in leaves and walk the familiar path to the lightning-scarred cedar. The act itself became a meditation. The crunch of my boots on the trail, the smell of pine and damp earth, the growing sense of anticipation as I got closer. My world had split in two. The official, documented life of Ranger Penn, and the silent, secret life of the man who fed a giant. I started to learn the signals, the rules of approach. One evening, as I neared the tree line by the cedar, I heard a new sound. It was a low, clear whistle, almost like the sound of wind blowing across the top of a narrow bottle. It came from the dense woods to my right, and it was repeated twice. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't the wind. It was a signal. It made the hair on my arms stand on end, but it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like permission, a sentry calling, "All clear." I took a breath and proceeded to the tree, left the offering, and walked away. From then on, I would listen for that whistle. It was our doorbell, our confirmation. If I heard it, the path was safe. If I didn't, I waited. Trusting that sound became an act of faith, and I quickly learned what the absence of that sound meant. About a month into our routine, I was approaching the cedar, feeling the familiar anticipation, but something was wrong. The forest was utterly still, not the usual quiet, but a dead, heavy silence. The insects had stopped chirping. The wind was gone. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, thick with a pressure I could feel on my skin. There was no whistle. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a full 10 minutes, every nerve on high alert. The message was as clear as any shout. Stay away, not now. I didn't question it. I turned around and walked back to the cabin, the offering still in my pack. The rule was learned and seared into my brain. Dead silence means danger. It means do not approach. The pact required me to listen, not just with my ears, but with my whole body. Another rule was established by my own foolishness. The urge to see him, even a glimpse, was a constant, gnawing temptation. One bright, clear afternoon, I manufactured a reason to patrol the high meadows near the cedar. I told myself I was checking for signs of illegal camping, but I was lying. I was hoping. As I moved through a stand of firs about 200 yards from the tree, I heard a sharp, violent crack directly above me. A heavy pine bough, thick as my thigh, crashed to the ground not 10 feet in front of me, showering me with needles. I jumped back, my heart pounding. I looked up. There was no wind. The branch hadn't just fallen. It felt like it had been broken and thrown. It was a warning shot. A clear, unambiguous message. This is a transaction for the shadows. The daylight is my world. The twilight is ours. Never again. The warnings weren't the only form of payment. The gifts started to evolve, becoming more specific, more tuned to my own life. I was tracking a bear that had been raiding campsites, following its trail up a steep ridge. As the trail forked, I found a single, long branch laid deliberately across the left-hand path. On the branch, 3 deep, parallel claw marks were gouged into the bark. It wasn't bear sign. It was his. And the branch pointed insistently toward the right-hand fork. I hesitated, then trusted the sign. An hour later, I heard the frustrated roar of the bear from the valley below, on the very trail I had avoided. He hadn't just saved me from a landslide. He was actively helping me do my job. He was protecting me from the other dangers of the forest. He was my unseen partner, my silent guardian. This was far beyond a simple trade for food. The moment the pact became something more, something unbreakable, was the winter of '77. I was down with a nasty bout of pneumonia, bedridden in my cabin for over a week, delirious with fever. I couldn't make the drops. I was racked with guilt and worry, convinced my failure would break our bond, that he would think I had abandoned him. when the fever finally broke, and I was strong enough to stumble to my front porch for a breath of frigid air, I found it. Sitting on the top step, covered in a light dusting of snow, was a small, crudely but beautifully woven basket of pine needles and cedar bark. And inside was a pristine cluster of oyster mushrooms, a rare winter delicacy, perfectly fresh. He hadn't just waited. He had noticed my absence, understood something was wrong, and had brought me an offering. It was a gesture of care, of concern. It was a gift. My eyes welled up. We weren't just partners anymore. We were friends. Soon after, the true mystery began to unfold. Tucked beside the food I'd leave, I started finding them. Small, smooth stones, worn by a river that fit perfectly in my palm. Each one was cold to the touch, but etched with markings. These weren't random scratches. They were deliberate patterns, carved with a sharp point. One had a spiral that coiled into itself. Another had a series of branching lines, like a river delta or the veins of a leaf. One had a row of chevrons, like migrating geese. They were symbols. It was a language. My mind reeled with the implications. This wasn't just an intelligent creature. This was a being with culture, with history, with the capacity for abstract thought. I began collecting the stones, hiding them in a loose-bottomed drawer in my desk. Each one was a word in a conversation I was only just beginning to understand. I kept one of them with me always. It was a dark, flat piece of slate, almost black, with a single, perfect spiral carved into its face. The groove was smooth, worn down as if by a worried thumb over many years. It felt warm in my pocket, an anchor to my secret reality. It was my proof, for an audience of one. That stone was a constant reminder that what I was doing was more than just a dangerous secret. It was an honor. I was the sole envoy to a hidden nation. The markings were a language I couldn't read, a story I couldn't comprehend, but I understood the intent behind them. It was a gift of trust, and I knew then, with a certainty that settled into my bones, that my life's purpose was no longer just to patrol a forest or enforce its rules. It was to protect this secret, and to listen to what it was trying to tell me. The phrase repeated in my mind, a quiet vow. Some things aren't meant to be found. The years folded into one another, marked not by calendars, but by the changing seasons of our pact. Our communication deepened, evolving past simple warnings and gifts of food. He started to show a personality, a sense of awareness that went beyond survival. One summer, I dropped my favorite hand axe while clearing a fallen log far from the cedar. I searched for an hour before giving it up as lost. 3 nights later, leaning against the base of our tree, was the axe. Its wooden handle had been wiped clean of mud, and it was propped up as if presented for inspection. He had backtracked my path, found something I valued, and returned it. This wasn't a trade. This was the act of a friend. I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He was watching, and he was learning what mattered to me. My lonely existence in the woods felt a little less lonely. Our shared language of stones also grew more complex. The symbols became more frequent, more varied. I began keeping a separate, hidden logbook, sketching each new stone and trying to decipher its meaning. A circle with a dot in the center, I decided, meant the sun or daylight. A jagged line clearly meant the river. A series of 3 small circles, I learned, meant family or others, a symbol that always sent a chill down my spine. I was building a dictionary for a language spoken by one, a Rosetta Stone for a forgotten people. The spiral, the first symbol he ever gave me, seemed to be the most important. It appeared often, sometimes by itself, sometimes linked to other symbols. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was central to his existence. I was no longer just feeding a creature. I was bearing witness to a history etched in stone, a history I felt a desperate need to understand before it vanished completely. The outside world, however, never stays out for long. Its noise always finds a way to seep through the trees. The first serious intrusion came in the form of poachers. I knew their type. They drove loud trucks, left their beer cans glittering in the undergrowth, and saw the forest not as a living thing but as a warehouse. One afternoon, the sharp crack of a high-powered rifle echoed from the ridge near the cedar, a sound that violated the deep peace of the area. My blood ran cold. Protocol demanded I call it in and wait for backup, but my pact demanded I act now. I grabbed my radio to make the call, my hand trembling with a mix of fury and fear. But before I could key the mic, The forest answered for me. It was a sound I had never heard before, not even from the ravine. It was a roar that was not born of pain, but of pure, calculated authority. It wasn't a panicked scream. It was a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very molecules of the air, a sound so primal and full of territorial rage it felt like the mountain itself was clearing its throat. The roar echoed for a full 10 seconds, rolling down the valleys and silencing everything. I heard a frantic shout from the ridge, the sound of men crashing through the brush, and then the panicked roar of a truck engine starting up and peeling away, tires spitting gravel. I never saw them, and I never saw him. He had protected his territory without ever revealing himself, using sound as his weapon. He had asserted his dominance, but in doing so, he had created a story that would be told in bars and on internet forums. Adding fuel to a fire I was desperately trying to keep smothered. He had solved a problem but created a much larger one. The forest has its own rules, but so does the modern world, and its primary rule is that no mystery can be left alone. The poachers were a simple, brutish threat. What came next was far more dangerous because it was smarter, quieter, and more insidious. The age of the internet arrived in the wilderness. It came in the form of tourists with GPS units who thought off trail was a suggestion, not a warning. It came as bloggers armed with cameras, hunting for the next viral hit, a grainy photo that could make them famous. And worst of all, it came in the form of drones. Small, buzzing machines that could go where people couldn't, peering into the hidden places of the forest from above. They were a violation of the deep privacy that was my ally's only real shield. The sanctity of the timberline, the isolation he depended on, was now under aerial assault from 100 tiny, seeing eyes. My job shifted from watching the forest to watching the watchers. He learned to recognize this new threat faster than I did. One evening, as I approached the cedar, I heard a new signal. It wasn't the welcoming whistle. It was a series of sharp, rapid clicks, like two stones being struck together. The sound was agitated, urgent. I stopped, scanning the trees, and followed the direction of the sound. There, caught in the high branches of a Douglas fir, was a small, white quadcopter drone, its lights blinking stupidly. Its operator was likely a mile away, staring at a blank screen, wondering where their toy had gone. He had identified the machine, understood its purpose, and guided me to it. I spent the next hour climbing that tree, my heart pounding with a new kind of paranoia. I retrieved the drone, took it back to my cabin, and smashed it to pieces with a hammer. It was my first true act of criminal sabotage. I was no longer just keeping a secret. I was actively destroying evidence. The near disaster I had always feared began not with a roar, but with a social media post. A well-known adventure blogger, a kid with more guts than sense, announced he was heading into the Mount Baker wilderness to investigate the Nooksack Ridge Roar, the very story those poachers had started. His last post was a smiling selfie with Mount Shuksan in the background, captioned, "Going off-grid to find the big guy. Don't send a search party unless I'm not back in 3 days." A wave of ice-cold dread washed over me. I knew exactly where he was going. He was walking straight into the heart of my secret, treating the most fragile place on Earth like a theme park. 2 days later, his rental car was found at a trailhead. He was officially declared a missing person. The circus had come to town, and I was expected to be its ringmaster. I had to stand in the incident command post, a temporary trailer buzzing with the nervous energy of an impending search, and stare at the topographical map spread out on the table. My supervisor? A good man named Henderson, who trusted me completely, pointed to the very ridge I had spent decades protecting. "Arthur," he said, "you know this area better than anyone alive. You'll take point with the first team. Find us a trail. Find us anything." Every head in the room turned to me. I was their expert, their veteran guide. And in that moment, I knew I had to become a liar. I had to use every ounce of my credibility, every bit of the trust I had earned over 40 years, to actively sabotage the most important search of my career. I could feel the weight of his life on one shoulder and the weight of my friend's existence on the other. I nodded, my face a stony mask of professionalism. "I'll find his trail," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. That night was the longest of my life. I led a team of 6 rangers into the darkening woods, the beams of our headlamps cutting through the gloom. But I wasn't searching. I was performing. I used every trick I knew to lead them in circles, to take them down false paths that ended in impassable thickets or sheer rock faces. I'd stop, kneel down, and pretend to examine a scuff mark on a rock that I'd made myself moments before. The rain we had 2 nights ago washed most of it out, I'd say, my voice steady. He was moving this way, but the trail goes cold here. We'll have to double back and try the lower valley. Every word was a betrayal to the men following me, men who were risking their own safety based on my guidance. The static crackle of the radio, with other teams reporting their positions, felt like a judgment. I was the hub of the search, and I was deliberately breaking it apart, spoke by spoke. The cost was not to my body, but to my soul. To look a young ranger in the eye, a kid who looked up to me, and point him toward a dead-end trail, knowing I was wasting precious time, was a special kind of hell. I was risking that blogger's life, gambling it against the safety of my friend. I felt like a traitor to my own uniform, to the very oath I had taken. The phrase, "to protect and preserve," echoed in my mind with bitter irony. What was I protecting? And what was I willing to sacrifice to do it? The moral certainty that had guided my life had dissolved into a fog of impossible choices. I was alone, truly alone, caught between 2 worlds that could not coexist, and my lies were the only thing holding them apart. I wasn't just hiding a secret anymore. I was becoming a different man to keep it, a man I wasn't sure I liked. On the second day of the search, while I was alone scouting a potential route, I found what I was looking for. Not the blogger, but proof. His bright yellow backpack was tangled in the roots of a fallen cedar, torn open, and a few feet away, placed with unmistakable intention, was a small, neat stack of 3 flat stones. The stop sign. The warning. My friend had tried to tell him. He had tried to turn him back, to keep him away, just as he had warned me away from the landslide years before. The blogger, in his arrogance, must have ignored it, dismissed it as a natural occurrence, and pushed forward. A cold relief mixed with my dread. He hadn't been attacked. He had been warned. The creature wasn't a monster. It was a guardian trying to protect its home from an intruder who wouldn't listen. This wasn't a predator's work. It was a consequence. I buried the backpack under the fallen cedar, kicking dirt and leaves over it until no trace remained. The search was officially called off a week later. The official story was that the blogger, an inexperienced hiker despite his online persona, had succumbed to the elements. Another ghost for the forest. I had succeeded. My secret was safe. But the incident left a permanent scar. I had been forced to show my hand, to manipulate the system I was a part of. And it raised a terrifying new question. While leading the search astray, I had been meticulous about keeping them away from the cedar, but also from another area, the abandoned silver mining claim on the South Ridge. It was a place he never went near, a place from which I would sometimes hear that agitated, clicking signal even when the sky was empty. My friend wasn't just afraid of people, he was afraid of a place. What was there? What secret was buried in that old mine that was even more dangerous than a circus of men with guns? The world felt smaller, the walls closing in. The blogger incident had been a close call, a desperate improvisation. I couldn't rely on luck and lies forever. My pact had begun as a quiet exchange, a secret comfort. Now, it was an active conspiracy. The intimacy of our silent conversations was now punctuated by the roar of an engine, the buzz of a drone, the ghost of a missing man. I was no longer a passive keeper of a secret. I was its active, and only, defender. The vow I had made to myself all those years ago, that some things aren't meant to be found, was no longer a quiet philosophy. It had become my life's mission, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the next threat wouldn't be a lost blogger. It would be something far more organized, far more powerful, and it would not be so easily misled. The turning point, the moment this pact I had made with the shadows became something more than a trade, was the summer of '08, the Skykomish River fire. It started with a single lightning strike on a bone-dry ridge and, fanned by hot, dry winds, it became a monster. It moved faster than any of the models predicted, leaping across canyons and roaring through old-growth timber with a sound like a freight train derailing in the heart of hell. The air for 50 miles turned a bruised, apocalyptic orange. Ash rained down like black snow, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. My official orders were clear. I was assigned to the lower valleys, coordinating the evacuation of the last few remote cabins and campsites, making sure no human life was left in the fire's path. My world was sirens, crackling radios, and the frightened faces of people losing everything. But my mind wasn't in the valley. My thoughts were on the high ridge, with the lightning-scarred cedar and the silent friend I hadn't heard from in days. Every instinct of duty, every rule of the chain of command told me to stay put, to do my job. Henderson's voice on the radio was tight with stress, directing resources, fighting a losing battle. To desert my post during a crisis like this wasn't just insubordination. It was a fireable offense, a betrayal of my team. But the image of the fire consuming that ridge, of him being trapped, burned, or forced to flee into unknown territory where he would certainly be seen. It was a torment I couldn't endure. The pact wasn't just about food anymore. It was about 40 years of shared silence, of returned axes and baskets of mushrooms. It was a friendship. And you don't abandon a friend to a fire. That ghost of the hiker I'd lost whispered to me again. But this time it wasn't a voice of guilt. It was a voice of resolve. This time, I wouldn't fail. I waited for a lull in the radio chatter, told my check-in I was making a final sweep of a remote access road, and I lied. I turned my truck away from the evacuation route and pointed it toward the smoke. The drive up the fire road was a descent into the inferno. The heat was so intense it shimmered in the air, and the paint on the hood of my truck began to blister and bubble. Small spot fires burned on either side of the road, and burning branches fell from the canopy like fiery spears. The roar of the main fire front was a constant, deafening presence, a physical pressure on my eardrums. My training screamed at me how stupid this was, how many ways I could die. A falling tree, a shift in the wind, a simple engine stall. Any of it would leave me to be cooked alive in my government-issue pickup. But I kept going, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the smoke-choked woods. I had to know. I had to see. I was no longer a ranger. I was just a man, driven by a desperate, foolish hope, heading into a fire for a friend that the world believed was a monster. The forest has its own rules, and I was learning the price for following them was steeper than I had ever imagined. I had to abandon the truck when a fallen Kaparoo burning fir blocked the road. I continued on foot, a wet bandana tied over my face, my eyes streaming from the smoke. I expected to find a scene of panicked flight, of scorched earth and absence. Instead, I found him. He wasn't fleeing. He was standing his ground. Through a haze of smoke, I saw his immense, dark form next to a small, hidden spring I knew well, a place where the water bubbled up cold and clear even in the driest summer. The fire was creeping down the slope toward it, and he was there, a lone guardian against the flames. He was using a massive fir bough like a giant broom, swatting away burning embers that landed near the water's edge, smothering spot fires with his huge, furred hands. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was trying to save the spring. The sight stunned me. There was no fear in his posture, no panic. There was only a grim, unwavering purpose. I moved closer, calling his name, a name I had only ever said in my own mind. And he turned. His great, dark eyes found me through the smoke. There was recognition, but no surprise. It was as if he had been expecting me. He let out a low grunt, a sound that was less a greeting and more an acknowledgement of our shared crisis. He looked exhausted. His fur was singed in places, and a dry, rattling cough shook his massive frame, a sound deeper and more ragged than what the smoke alone could account for. For the first time, I saw a fragility in him that the years had hidden. He was older, wearier. The silent giant of the forest seemed, in the hellish orange light of the fire, terribly mortal. He took a step back from the spring, a gesture of invitation, and looked from me to the water and back to me. He was showing me what he was protecting. He needed me to understand. This spring was a vital artery for this entire section of the forest. It was the only source of clean, year-round water for miles. A place I knew every animal on the mountain depended on. To see him defending it, to see him risk his own life, not for himself, but for the ecosystem he was a part of, it changed everything. This wasn't the behavior of a dumb beast or a monster. It was the act of a king defending the last well in his kingdom. It was an act of profound responsibility. He was more a part of this forest than I could ever be. I was just a visitor in a uniform. He was the forest. As I stood there, taking in the scene, he coughed again, that same dry, painful sound. Then he did something that chilled me more than the fire. He reached out, not to me, but to the smooth granite rock face beside the spring, and tapped it with one long finger. My eyes followed his gesture. There, on the rock, almost invisible under a thin layer of soot, were scratches. The same kind of markings I'd seen on the river stones he'd left me, but larger, deeper. It was a mural, a story. He wiped a hand across the stone, clearing the ash. The first image was unmistakable. A crude but clear depiction of a small, stick-figure human, like me, offering something to a much taller, broader figure. It was a perfect, heartbreaking image of our ritual at the cedar tree. The food, the offering, the pact. To see it drawn out, to know he saw our relationship in the same way I did, as a deliberate exchange between two beings. It struck me speechless. He saw me not as a threat or a resource, but as the other half of an agreement. He was documenting our shared history on the wall of his most sacred place. Then he pointed to a second symbol, just below the first. It was a drawing of a plant, but it was wrong. The stalk was bent and weak, and the roots, which were shown in great detail, were withered and thin. They didn't dig into the earth. They seemed to be crumbling, turning to dust. It was a symbol of sickness, of decay from the foundation up. It was a picture of something dying, not from an external wound, but from an internal blight. A cold dread, a feeling completely separate from the fear of the fire around us, began to creep into my heart. These weren't just historical records. This was a message. He wasn't just showing me what he was protecting. He was trying to tell me why. The image of that withered plant, of its failing roots, burned itself into my mind. Some things aren't meant to be found, but he was desperately trying to make me find this. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze filled with an intelligence and a sorrow that was devastatingly clear. He tapped his own broad chest with a closed fist, then pointed again to the symbol of the withered plant. Then he did it again. Me. This. Me. This. He was telling me, in the only way he could, that the drawing was about him, about his people. It wasn't a symbol of a dying plant. It was a self-portrait of a dying species. The cough that shook him wasn't just from the smoke. It was a symptom of this deeper illness, this failure at the roots of his being. The truth began to dawn on me, a horrifying, fragmented idea that I couldn't yet fully grasp. Our entire relationship, the food I brought him, the decades of our pact, it wasn't just about staving off hunger. It was something else. It was medicine. It was a desperate attempt to treat an incurable disease. The roar of the fire grew louder, a nearby tree crashing to the ground and sending a wave of heat washing over us. The moment was broken. He let out a low grunt and turned back to his work, swatting at a fresh shower of embers that threatened the spring. The message had been delivered. I understood now that his struggle was not just against the modern world of cameras and poachers, but against a deeper, more insidious enemy that was attacking him from within. My role in his life had just been reframed. I wasn't a friend helping a peer. I was a doctor providing a treatment I didn't understand for a disease I couldn't comprehend. I was keeping him alive, but I wasn't making him well. I backed away slowly. The heat of the fire on my skin, nothing compared to the cold certainty that had settled in my soul. I was the keeper of a secret far greater and more tragic than I had ever known. Leaving him there, a lone, singed giant, fighting a losing battle against the flames to protect a single spring, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I stumbled back to my truck through the smoke, my mind reeling. The drawings on the rock, the cough, the desperate defense of the water. It was all a language I was just beginning to learn, and it spoke of a terrible, quiet extinction. When I got back to the command post, covered in soot, I mumbled an excuse about getting cut off by a flare-up. Henderson just looked at me, his face etched with exhaustion, and clapped me on the shoulder. He saw a hero who had risked himself. He didn't see the truth, that I was a man who had just looked into the eyes of a fading god and understood that my small offerings were all that stood between him and the abyss. That fire changed me. It burned away the last of my identity as a ranger and forged me into something new, the sole witness to a tragedy the world would never know. What he showed me in the smoke and flames that day was a turning point. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them. It was about a truth much bigger than one creature in one forest. If you're starting to see that this story is about more than just a monster, If you feel the weight of what I'm trying to tell you, please help me get this out there. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion. Share it. The world needs to understand what we're losing, and you need to hear the final, terrible piece of the puzzle that I learned in our very last meeting. You need to hear what that sickness really is, and why we are the cause of it. That fire didn't just burn the trees, it burned away my cover. It drew a kind of attention I had never accounted for. An attention that was quiet, patient, and wore a government badge. They didn't arrive with sirens and helicopters. They arrived in unmarked sedans that were the same color as a cloudy sky, their presence announced by nothing more than a new, neatly typed notice pinned to the ranger station bulletin board. It was a federal team, a discrete branch of the Department of the Interior, calling themselves the Ecological Anomaly Unit. Their official mission, the paper said, was to study the unique soil and water contamination patterns in the wake of the Skycomish fire. It was the perfect cover. They weren't looking for a creature, they were just scientists, but I saw the way they moved, the quiet professionalism in their eyes, the way they never looked at the scenery but always at the ground, the tree line, the shadows. Their leader was a woman named Dr. Thorne. She had short, graying hair and eyes that missed nothing, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and her gaze felt like it was taking a core sample from my soul. The dread started as a low hum and grew into a roar. Thorne's team, with their array of sophisticated-looking cases and equipment, made a beeline for the one place I prayed they would ignore, the hidden spring, the very place he had defended. Within a week, the chatter at the station was all about Thorne's fascinating discoveries. She had found mineral deposits in the spring water that had no business being there, trace amounts of zinc, selenium, and manganese in concentrations that were geologically impossible for the area. Then came the soil samples, containing what she vaguely referred to as anomalous, complex proteins that defied classification. She spoke with a calm, academic excitement that turned my blood to ice. They were digging in the one place where our two worlds had collided, the place where he had bled, where he had left his biological signature. They weren't just in my forest anymore, they were in his sanctuary, and they were beginning to find the ghost I had spent a lifetime trying to hide. The forest has its own rules, but science has its own, and they are relentless. The pressure soon turned from the general to the specific. Thorne requested a consultation, a meeting in the incident command trailer that still smelled of stale coffee and old smoke. She had my entire 48 years of service laid out before her, not as a history, but as a data set. She had unrolled topographical maps overlaid with transparent sheets. On them, in precise red ink, were my patrol routes, painstakingly copied from decades of my logbooks. "It's remarkable, Mr. Penn," she said, her voice smooth and even. "For 40 years, your patrols have created a near-perfect, unspoken perimeter around this one specific quadrant." She tapped the map, her finger landing right between the lightning-scarred cedar and the old mining claim. "You're the most experienced ranger we have. You know this terrain better than anyone. So tell me, what's in this blank space you've so consistently avoided?" The question hung in the air, stripped of all politeness. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. My own life's work, my diligence, was being used as a weapon against me. Paranoia became my constant companion, a shadow that walked a pace behind me on every trail. I'd be on a routine patrol and a flicker of movement would catch my eye. It wouldn't be a deer or a bird. It would be a small, dark box strapped to a tree, its surface non-reflective, its shape designed to blend in with the bark. They were disguised as meteorological sensors or wildlife cameras, but I knew better. I recognized the design from federal law enforcement manuals. They were seismic sensors, capable of detecting footfalls, of weighing a target, of mapping its movements through vibration alone. The clicks from the tree line became more frequent, more agitated. He knew. He could feel the forest being wired for sound, being turned into a laboratory cage. My sanctuary was gone. It was now an observation chamber, and I was no longer its warden, but just another specimen being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, no longer spoke of the forest's life, but of its violation. My own quiet footsteps felt like a betrayal, leading them closer. The pact, the simple sacred ritual that had structured my secret life for decades, began to break down. Getting to the cedar tree became a high-stakes mission. Their invisible grid of sensors was everywhere. I couldn't trust my old paths. I had to move through the thickest brush, ford streams in the dark, using every bit of my skill, not just to be silent, but to mimic the sound and weight of a deer or a bear. The welcoming whistle from the tree line fell silent. The only signal I heard now was that sharp, frantic clicking, a constant warning of technology's presence. I'd leave the offerings in new places, less secure, more exposed, hoping he would find them. Sometimes they were taken. Sometimes they rotted where I left them. Our conversation was being jammed, our connection severed by a web of wires and unseen watchers. The regularity and trust that had been the bedrock of our bond was crumbling, and with it, I feared, his health. That dry, rattling cough I'd heard during the fire echoed in my memory, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Thorne began to tighten the net, her questions becoming more pointed, her theories more direct. She called me in again, this time with a file on her desk. It was the missing bloggers file. "We've been cross-referencing GPS data from the search teams," she said, not looking at me, but at the file. "The one area that was barely covered, the area you yourself designated as a low probability zone due to difficult terrain, is precisely where our sensors are picking up the most significant seismic activity. A single, heavy bipedal signature." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Isn't it odd, Mr. Penn, that the place you steered everyone away from happens to be the epicenter of our anomaly?" I could feel the sweat prickle on my neck. I gave her my best tired, old man shrug. "It's a big forest, Doctor, full of shadows and strange echoes." But my voice sounded thin, hollow even to my own ears. She knew I was lying. The question was no longer if she would find him, but what I would do when she did. The days became a tense waiting game. The nights became a new kind of horror. From the window of my patrol cabin, I could see them, low, silent shapes drifting over the ridges, moving with an unnatural smoothness that was nothing like an owl or a bat. They were thermal imaging drones, hunting for heat in the cold darkness. I would stand there in my own unlit cabin, watching those ghostly machines conduct their methodical sweeps, my heart a cold, heavy knot in my chest. He was out there, a 9-foot-tall furnace of life, and to their infrared eyes, he would light up like a bonfire. I felt utterly helpless, a prisoner in my own home, watching them hunt my friend with technology I couldn't fight. I thought about starting a dozen small, smoky fires to cloud their vision. Anything to give him a place to hide. But it was useless. They were too systematic. I was just a man with a secret, and they were the United States government. The scale of the fight was impossibly mismatched. One moonless night, driven by a desperate need to know he was still safe, I risked a trip toward the old timberline. I didn't go to the cedar, but to a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley. The air was cold and dead. There was no whistle, no clicking, nothing. I thought he was gone, that they had scared him away for good. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. Placed on a flat rock was a single, familiar stone. It was a dark piece of slate, etched with the spiral symbol, our symbol, the one I carried in my pocket. But this one was different. A deep, jagged crack ran right through the center of the spiral, a crack that looked fresh. It was a deliberate break. It was a message of something shattered. Beside it were two other etchings I had never seen before, a crude stick figure of a human, and next to it, a series of sharp, jagged lines that I instinctively understood to mean pain or danger. The message was terrifyingly clear. The humans are here. They are a danger. Our bond is broken. He wasn't just hiding. He was saying goodbye. The pretense finally dropped. Thorne didn't summon me. She cornered me as I was refueling my truck at the station's pump. Her eyes had lost their academic curiosity and were now cold and hard. "Let's stop playing games, Arthur," she said, her voice low. "The fire didn't create these anomalies. It only exposed them. We've been tracking a pattern of statistically improbable disappearances, seismic signatures, and anomalous infrasound recordings in this sector for 30 years. My unit isn't here for soil samples." She took a step closer, invading my space. We believe something has been intelligently and deliberately managing this territory for a very long time. Something that actively avoids human contact and technology. And we believe you've been in contact with it. We believe you know exactly what it is." The term ecological anomaly was no longer an abstract. It was a target, and she had just painted it on my friend's back, and on mine. Some things aren't meant to be found, but they had found the trail. And I was the trail. The final blow came not from Thorne, but from my own world. Henderson, my supervisor for 15 years, called me into his office. He couldn't meet my eye. He just stared at a spot on the wall behind my head as he spoke. "Arthur," he began, his voice strained. "I've received a directive from the regional office. It's unusual." He slid a piece of paper across his desk. It was an official order from the Department of the Interior. They were invoking a special provision of the National Forest Management Act, placing my entire patrol sector under restricted federal jurisdiction for a sensitive and time-critical ecological survey. My heart sank. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew. Henderson finally looked at me, his face full of apology and confusion. "It means they're closing the area, to everyone, including us. Your patrol routes are being reassigned to the eastern slope. Effective immediately." They were cutting me off. They were surgically removing me from the equation, taking away my access, my eyes, my ability to protect him. They were clearing the field for the final act, and I had just been escorted off the stage. I couldn't let that be the end. Being shuffled off to the eastern slope while they closed in on him felt like a betrayal deeper than any lie I had ever told. That night, I broke the last rule I had left. I didn't sign out a vehicle. I didn't take a radio. Under the cover of a moonless, overcast sky, I walked into my own forest like a trespasser, a ghost returning to his haunting grounds. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like a federal agent. Every shadow held the threat of a censor. I was moving against a direct federal order. This was no longer about my pension or my reputation. This was about a final farewell, about looking him in the eye one last time. I didn't know what I would do when I found him. I only knew I had to. The secret had started with me, and I would be damned if it ended with a woman in a lab coat holding a clipboard. I owed him a better ending than that. I owed him the dignity of a choice. The air on the high ridge was wrong. It was thick with a silence that wasn't natural. It was the dead quiet of surveillance, the low, almost subliminal hum of hidden technology. He wasn't at the cedar. He wasn't at the spring. My heart hammered with the fear that I was too late. But then, from the direction of the old, abandoned mining claim, the place he always avoided, I heard it. The sharp, frantic clicking, a sound of pure panic. I moved toward it, my feet silent on the pine needles, and I saw him, a great shadow against the rock face, pacing, agitated. He saw me, and for the first time in our long history, he didn't wait. He moved toward me, not with aggression, but with a desperate urgency. He grabbed my arm. The strength was terrifying, but the grip was gentle. He pulled me, his intent undeniable. He was leading me into the one place he had always warned me away from. He was taking me into the heart of his fear. He led me into the dark, yawning mouth of the old silver mine. The air instantly turned cold and smelled of damp rock and something else, something ancient and wild. My small flashlight beam cut a pathetic swathe in the oppressive dark. He guided me past collapsed timbers and rusting ore carts, his huge form moving with a certainty that told me he knew these tunnels intimately. The clicking sound stopped, replaced by the echo of our steps and the slow drip, drip of water from the rock ceiling. He was pulling me deeper into the mountain, into a place I had marked on my maps for decades as unstable and dangerous. We were going somewhere no human had been for 100 years. The message was clear. The rules were gone. The perimeter was broken. He was going to show me the final, terrible truth he had been protecting all this time. The truth that was even more important than his own life. After a quarter-mile walk into the black, he pushed aside a section of rock wall that I had mistaken for a cave-in. Behind it was not a mine shaft, but a vast natural cavern. The air here was different, warmer, humid, and alive. The sound of the dripping was louder, echoing off what I knew were impossibly high ceilings. My flashlight beam was swallowed by the space. And then I heard it, a low, wet cough from the darkness, not his. A slow, heavy shuffle of another immense body. Then another. My light swept across the cavern floor. There were 3 others. One was ancient, her fur almost entirely gray, curled into a ball and shivering despite the warmth. Another lay on his side, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. They were old, they were frail, and they were dying. The cavern was not a home, it was a hospice, and the walls, as far as my light could reach, were covered in those same symbols. A library of a forgotten history, a tomb for a fading people. He let go of my arm and walked to the center of the cavern. His shoulders slumped with a weight I now understood was not just age, but grief. He pointed a long finger to the far wall, to a familiar symbol, the withered plant with the crumbling roots. Then he tapped his own chest, and then pointed to the others, his gesture encompassing the whole sad, dying family. Then he did something that stopped my heart. He reached into a fold of his matted fur and pulled out a small, crinkled object, a candy bar wrapper. One of ours. One of mine. He held it up in the beam of my flashlight, then pointed to the symbol of the human giving the offering. He then pointed to his own mouth, and then made a gesture not of hunger, but of relief, of a fever breaking. The pieces clicked into place in my mind with the sickening finality of a cell door slamming shut. The food, the junk food. It wasn't about calories. It was about what was in it. The truth hit me like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. It wasn't a mystery. It was chemistry. Thorne's report about the geologically impossible minerals in the spring, zinc, selenium, fortified vitamins, the trace elements that their natural diet no longer provided, leached from the soil by a century of our industry and our acid rain. Their biology was failing, crumbling from the roots up, just like the symbol on the wall. They were suffering from a profound, species-wide nutritional deficiency, a slow-motion extinction event. And the only thing holding it at bay, the only available source for the minerals they so desperately needed to survive, was us. Our processed, fortified, mineral-enriched junk food. Our garbage was their medicine. We were the disease that had ravaged their world, and we were the source of the only cure they had left. We are their poison and their cure. This was the terrible, humbling reason. They don't hide from us out of fear of being found. They hide because they need us, and they are ashamed. In that moment of devastating clarity, the world outside crashed in. A dozen powerful floodlights ignited at the cave mouth, blinding me, throwing the cavern and its sad inhabitants into stark, cruel relief. Arthur Penn, it's over. Step out slowly. Thorne's voice, amplified and metallic, echoed through the chamber. The other creatures recoiled, letting out low moans of terror. They had followed me. The entire thing, my reassignment, my freedom to move, had been a feint. They had let me lead them to the prize. I looked at my friend. He wasn't looking at Thorne's lights. He was looking at me. His eyes were not full of fear or anger. They were full of a deep, ancient sorrow and a terrible, trusting resignation. He knew it was over, and in his eyes, I saw my final choice. I was the one who started this. I would be the one to end it. On my terms, not theirs. I gave him one last, fleeting look of apology, of farewell. Then I turned and scrambled toward the northern wall of the cavern, to a place I had noted on a geological survey map 30 years prior. A fault line, a precarious balance of stone and gravity. Thorne was shouting my name, but it was just noise. I braced my feet and threw my entire body weight against a massive, key-locking boulder. For a second, nothing. Then, a deep groan from the mountain, a grinding crack echoed through the cave, and with a deafening roar, the ceiling above the entrance gave way. Tons of rock and earth cascaded down, a thunderous curtain of finality. The lights from outside were snuffed out, plunging us into absolute darkness, the roar replaced by the sound of settling dust and my own ragged breathing. I had saved them from Thorne's cage, but I had buried them alive. I turned and walked toward the rubble, toward the sound of Thorne's furious, muffled shouts, and surrendered. My confession was simple, and to them, insane. I admitted to ecologically motivated sabotage, claiming I had destroyed the mine entrance to prevent any future development. They tore my career apart, revoked my pension, and painted me as a crazy old ranger who finally cracked under the pressure of a lifetime of solitude. I accepted the quiet disgrace. There would be no proof of what I had seen. The small carved river rock with the spiral, the first piece of language he ever gave me, I had thrown it into a deep crevasse hours before, a secret returned to the earth. But secrets have a way of leaving echoes. In my final, mandatory incident report, written under guard, I described finding a unique geological anomaly on a piece of slate near the sabotaged mine. I drew it with perfect accuracy. A single, perfect spiral, a meaningless doodle to them, but to Thorne, with her keen eyes, I wonder if she ever looked at it again, and saw not a rock pattern, but a symbol, a question, a signature from a ghost. My greatest secret is not that they exist. It is the terrible irony of their existence, that we, in our careless, forward-marching ambition, poisoned their world so completely that our poison became their only medicine. And I, in my attempt to help, only deepened their dependence on a cure that came from their destroyers. My final choice was a cruel one. I saved them from the horror of a laboratory, but I condemned them. I sealed them off from their only source of treatment, from the fortified scraps of our world. I bought them peace, but at the cost of a slow, inevitable decline in the dark. Sometimes, late at night, I hold the memory of that last look from my friend, a look of trust. And I wonder if he understood what I was doing, that I was taking away their only hope, in a desperate, final act of love. You've stayed to the end, and now you know the truth that I've carried for all these years. It's a heavy burden, and I'm glad to finally share it. If this story has meant something to you, if you believe that some secrets deserve to be known, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this with others. There are more stories hidden in the shadows, and we need to listen. Now, there's another confession waiting for you, a story from the frozen north that's even colder than this one. Click the video on your screen to hear it. Don't let these echoes fade into silence.